They tell you God keeps score. 3 strikes and you're out. Miss once, learn a lesson. Miss twice, feel the weight. Miss 3 times, start praying harder. But nobody talks about the 4th time, the one where even faith feels quiet, the one where you did everything right, showed up again, believed again, and still watched it slip through your fingers. That's the moment people don't clap for. That's the moment they stop giving speeches and start giving distance. They say maybe it wasn't meant for you. Maybe the message is to stop trying. Funny how quickly trust God turns into know your place. Because missing the 4th time doesn't just test patience, it messes with identity. It makes you question whether persistence is devotion or delusion, whether hope is courage or just a bad habit you can't quit. You start replaying every move, every prayer, every step, wondering if you misunderstood the instructions, if you heard the call wrong, if you were arrogant enough to think the universe owed you a different ending. And the silence after that miss is louder than any failure before it. It's not dramatic, it's calm, almost polite, like the world is waiting to see what you do when even belief feels embarrassed. That's where things get interesting, because most people don't break at the first loss or the second or even the third. They break when the pattern starts to feel personal, when the story they told themselves about purpose starts cracking, when the scoreboard doesn't match the effort. Missing the 4th time feels like a verdict, like a quiet sentence passed without explanation. And that's exactly why it matters. Because if you're still standing there, still breathing, still angry, still curious, still unwilling to walk away, then maybe the miss wasn't a rejection, maybe it was a question. Not about faith, not about worth, but about how much of you is left when the reward is gone and all that remains is the decision to continue anyway. The 4th miss feels personal in a way the others never did. The first time, you shrug it off, bad timing, inexperience. You tell yourself it's part of the process. The second time stings more, but it still feels negotiable. You adjust, recalibrate, convince yourself you're learning something useful. The third time hurts enough to make you question your approach, but there's still a narrative that keeps you moving forward. Growth takes time. Faith gets tested. Champions are forged in failure. All very poetic, all very survivable. But the 4th time doesn't feel like a lesson anymore. It feels like a message with your name on it. By the 4th miss, coincidence stops being comforting. Patterns start forming whether you want them to or not. You replay the moments leading up to it, not casually, but obsessively. Every choice feels heavier in hindsight. Every small mistake grows teeth. And the worst part isn't the failure itself, it's how quiet everything becomes afterward. No dramatic collapse, no thunder, just silence. A clean, unsettling silence that makes you wonder if the universe is done negotiating with you. Like it's folded its arms and decided to wait you out. People around you start reacting differently too. Their encouragement changes tone. It becomes softer, slower, cautious. They stop asking when you'll try again and start asking if you're okay. That's when you know something shifted. The 4th miss doesn't just challenge your confidence, it changes how others perceive your persistence. What once looked like dedication now starts looking excessive. What once felt admirable begins to look uncomfortable. They don't say it directly, but you can feel it. Maybe this is where you stop, and that's what makes it feel personal. It's no longer just about the outcome, it's about identity. About whether the story you've been telling yourself still holds up under pressure. You start questioning not just your strategy, but your character. Are you resilient, or are you stubborn? Are you faithful, or are you blind? Are you committed, or just afraid to admit defeat? The 4th miss forces those questions into the open, and none of them have easy answers. They sit there, unresolved, poking at the parts of you that were built on certainty. There's also anger, but it's a complicated kind. Not explosive, not theatrical. It's quiet, restrained, almost polite. You don't want to be angry at God or fate or life, so the anger turns inward. You blame yourself for believing too hard, hoping too long, wanting too much. You replay every prayer, every intention, wondering if you misunderstood the rules of the game. Maybe you were arrogant to assume effort mattered. Maybe consistency doesn't mean anything. Maybe the universe doesn't reward persistence the way motivational quotes promised. What really unsettles people is that the fourth miss removes excuses. By now, you've worked harder than most would. You've shown up when quitting would have been reasonable. You've endured embarrassment, doubt, and fatigue. So when it still doesn't work, you're left without a clean explanation. And humans hate unexplained effort. They need cause and effect. They need morality baked into outcomes. The fourth miss violates that expectation. It suggests that effort and reward are not always linked, and that idea terrifies people who rely on fairness to make sense of suffering. Inside you, something fractures slightly, not enough to break, but enough to let new thoughts in, dangerous thoughts. Thoughts like, what if this isn't about success at all? What if the point was to see how much rejection I could absorb without changing who I am? What if the miss isn't punishment but pressure? Pressure to strip away ego, expectation, even hope itself, until all that remains is a raw decision to continue or not. And that decision becomes heavier than any outcome you were chasing. The fourth miss isolates you in a way the others didn't. Fewer people understand why you're still standing there. Fewer people are willing to listen to your reasons. They've moved on emotionally, even if you haven't. You start carrying the weight alone, and solitude has a way of clarifying things brutally. In that quiet space, without applause or reassurance, you find out what actually drives you. Not ambition, not validation, something deeper, something darker, a refusal to let a pattern dictate your worth. And that's why the fourth miss feels personal, because it strips away the audience, the encouragement, the safety net of optimism, and leaves you face to face with yourself. No slogans, no guarantees, just the uncomfortable realization that if you continue, it won't be because you're promised a reward. It will be because walking away would mean accepting a version of yourself you don't recognize. Silence after effort is the real test, because noise at least tells you where you stand. Failure with calm. Mentoring still feels negotiable. Someone explains it, someone critiques it, someone argues about it. But silence is different. Silence doesn't explain itself. It doesn't justify. It doesn't comfort. It just sits there, staring back at you, daring you to make sense of it on your own. After you've poured everything in, after you've shown up again and again, silence feels like being ignored by something that was supposed to be watching. You expect resistance, you expect obstacles, you even expect rejection. Those things make sense. They're part of the story. They give you something to push against. But silence offers no leverage. It doesn't tell you if you were close or far off. It doesn't tell you if you misunderstood the assignment or if the assignment was never meant for you. It just removes feedback entirely. And humans are not built for that. We are wired to interpret signals, to read reactions, to adjust. Silence breaks that system. It leaves you alone with your interpretation, and that's where things start getting dangerous. Because in silence, imagination takes over. You start filling in the gaps with your worst theories. Maybe you weren't good enough. Maybe you waited too long. Maybe you tried too hard. Maybe effort itself was the mistake. Silence doesn't correct those thoughts. It lets them roam freely, and the longer the quiet lasts, the more convincing they become. Not because they're true, but because they're unanswered. Silence has a way of giving doubt a microphone and telling it to speak uninterrupted. People don't talk about how humiliating silence can feel. You did the work, you took the risk, you exposed yourself to failure, and then nothing, no response, no acknowledgement, no clear direction. It feels like being left unread by the universe, and that kind of indifference cuts deeper than criticism ever could. Criticism at least acknowledges your existence. Silence makes you question whether you mattered at all. What's worse is how silence reframes effort. When there's no immediate outcome, no recognition, no visible progress, effort starts to feel naive, almost childish, like you believed in a story that wasn't real. You start hearing voices not from others but from inside yourself, asking when belief turns into delusion, asking how long persistence is noble before it becomes embarrassing. Silence doesn't answer those questions. It lets them echo. The people around you notice the silence too. They don't know what to say, so they say nothing, or they say something vague. Give it time. Everything happens for a reason. Empty phrases meant to fill the gap but never quite reaching the depth of what you're experiencing. Their discomfort adds another layer to the quiet. You realize they don't know how to sit with unresolved effort. They need outcomes to stay engaged. Without results, they slowly drift away, leaving you with your thoughts and the sound of your own breathing. And that's when silence becomes the real test. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's subtle. It doesn't challenge you openly. It waits. It watches. It asks one simple question without words. Will you continue without applause? Will you continue without reassurance? Will you continue when even faith feels like it's being ignored? Because anyone can move forward when the path is lit and the crowd is cheering. But silence strips the path bare. It removes the signs. It leaves you with nothing but the choice to take another step or not. Silence also exposes motive. When no one is watching, when nothing seems to be happening, the reason you started gets interrogated. If your motivation was recognition, silence suffocates it. If it was validation, silence starves it. Only the deepest reasons survive prolonged quiet. Only the reasons that do. And depend on reaction, reward, or reassurance. Silence is a filter. It eliminates the shallow motives and forces the real ones to reveal themselves, whether you like them or not. There's a cruelty in that process, but also clarity. In silence, you learn how much of your drive was external. You learn how attached you were to outcomes you couldn't control. And you learn whether your identity is tied to results or to action itself. Silence doesn't tell you if you're right or wrong. It tells you whether you're willing to keep going without knowing. That uncertainty is unbearable for most people. That's why so many stop there. Not because they failed, but because the quiet convinced them they were invisible. But if you stay, if you keep moving in that silence, something shifts internally. You stop waiting for permission. You stop waiting for signs. You stop waiting for noise. The effort becomes its own justification. The action becomes self-contained. And the silence, which once felt like abandonment, starts to feel like space. Empty, unsettling space where something new can form, where motivation is no longer borrowed from applause but generated from within, where the absence of response stops being a verdict and starts being a canvas. Faith gets uncomfortable when results don't show, because belief is easy when it's being rewarded. When things line up, when progress is visible, when effort produces something you can point to, faith feels rational. It feels justified. It feels almost intelligent. But strip the results away, and suddenly belief feels awkward, exposed, even embarrassing. You start wondering if you misunderstood the agreement. If faith was supposed to be transactional. If patience had an expiration date nobody told you about. At first, you reassure yourself. You tell yourself this is how it works. Delays happen, tests exist for a reason. You double down. You pray harder, focus sharper, clean up your intentions. You convince yourself that discomfort is just part of the process, that growth lives in the waiting. And for a while that story holds. It keeps you steady, it keeps you moving. But when the results still don't show, when the waiting stretches past what feels reasonable, faith starts to lose its polish. That's when belief becomes inconvenient. It no longer fits neatly into conversations. People stop asking how it's going, or they ask in a way that already assumes the answer. They tilt their heads, soften their voices. Faith without evidence makes people nervous. It disrupts their need for cause and effect. They want to see the proof. They want outcomes they can understand. And when you don't have those, belief starts to look like denial. Optimism starts to look like avoidance. Persistence starts to look like stubbornness. Inside you, the discomfort grows quietly, not as panic, but as tension. A constant low-grade pressure that sits behind every thought. You replay your assumptions. You question your interpretation. You wonder if faith is supposed to feel this lonely. Nobody tells you that belief can isolate you. Nobody tells you that trusting without confirmation feels less like courage and more like standing in a room where everyone else has already left. What makes it worse is that faith doesn't come with clear metrics. There's no progress bar, no confirmation message, no subtle nod from the universe saying you're on the right track. You're just there, showing up, believing into empty space. And the longer the space stays empty, the louder the questions get. Not angry questions, honest ones. Questions that don't attack belief but interrogate it. Questions that make you uncomfortable because they don't have clean answers. You start to notice how conditional most faith actually is. How often belief is cerebra, TED only when it pays off. How quickly people credit strategy when things work and dismiss faith as coincidence. Faith is praised in hindsight, not in the middle. Nobody claps for belief that hasn't been validated yet. Nobody lines up to support trust that hasn't proven itself. So when results don't show, you're left carrying something heavy without witnesses. There's also a quiet resentment that creeps in. Not toward God, not outwardly at least, but toward the idea that effort should matter, that sincerity should count for something. You don't voice it because it feels dangerous, almost blasphemous. So you swallow it, you smile, you keep saying the right things. But internally, belief starts to feel like a risk rather than a refuge. Something that costs you socially, emotionally, psychologically. And that's where faith becomes uncomfortable enough to change you. Because once belief stops being supported by outcomes, it stops being decorative. It becomes raw. It loses its slogans. It sheds its certainty. You're no longer believing because it's inspiring or because it feels good. You're believing because letting go would collapse something fundamental inside you. Faith turns from confidence into endurance. People misunderstand this stage. They think doubt has arrived, but it's not doubt, it's exposure. Faith without results removes all the padding. There's no reward to lean on, no reassurance to hide behind. Just you and the decision to keep trusting something you can't see, can't measure, can't explain to others without sounding foolish. And that foolishness is the price. That's the toll nobody warns you about. You start realizing that faith isn't meant to be comfortable. Comfort comes from control, and faith exists where control ends. When results don't show, belief forces you to confront why you believed in the first place. Was it for the outcome, or was it for alignment? Was it for the reward, or was it because walking without belief felt emptier than waiting with it? These questions don't resolve neatly. They sit with you, they reshape you. And somewhere in that discomfort, something subtle happens. Your belief stops being performative. You stop explaining it. You stop defending it. You stop needing others to understand. Faith becomes quieter, heavier, more private, less about hope, more about resolve, less about expectation, more about commitment. And while the world might read that silence as uncertainty, internally it becomes something else entirely. A decision to stand in the absence of results without turning belief into a condition, without bargaining, without needing proof to justify staying where you are. Persistence starts to look like madness the moment it stops being convenient. When you keep going past the point where applause fades, where encouragement dries up, where even the people who once believed start glancing at you like they're checking for cracks. At first, persistence is praised. It's called grit, resilience, discipline. But that praise has a time limit. Once you cross it, the label changes. Now it's obsession. Now it's denial. Now it's that uncomfortable thing people don't quite know how to talk about without lowering their voice. The world likes effort with expiration dates. Try hard, but not too long. Believe, but not after repeated disappointment. Keep faith, but only while it looks sensible from the outside. Persistence that overstays its welcome makes people nervous because it refuses to follow the script. It doesn't know when to bow out gracefully. It doesn't understand social cues. It just keeps showing up, and that's unsettling. Not because it's wrong, but because it exposes how conditional most commitment really is. You can see it in their faces, the subtle shift, the supportive smiles and cautious. Advice turns indirect. They stop saying you've got this and start saying whatever you decide is fine, which is another way of saying they've already decided for you. They've quietly marked the point where they would have stopped, and every step you take beyond that feels like an accusation. Your persistence becomes a mirror, and people don't like what it reflects back at them. What they don't understand is that persistence isn't always loud or hopeful. Sometimes it's exhausted, sometimes it's mechanical, sometimes it's just muscle memory refusing to shut down. You're not driven by optimism anymore. You're driven by refusal to let unfinished effort define you, refusal to accept that walking away automatically means wisdom. Persistence at this stage isn't pretty. It's not motivational poster material. It's raw, stripped of romance, fueled by something darker and more honest. This is where the madness label starts to stick. Because from the outside it looks irrational. The numbers don't add up. The pattern doesn't look promising. The results aren't improving fast enough. And in a world obsessed with efficiency, persistence without immediate payoff looks like a waste. People don't ask what it's costing you internally to stop. They only measure what it's costing you to continue. They don't see the weight of surrender. They only see the stubbornness of endurance. And the irony is that the same people calling it madness often admire persistence in retrospect. Once it works, once it pays off, once there's a neat arc they can point to and say, see, that's why you never give up. They sanitize it. They edit out the uncomfortable middle. They erase the version of you that kept going when it didn't make sense. Because that version threatens the idea that success is always logical, always well-timed, always socially approved. Inside your own head, it gets messy too. You start asking yourself the same questions they're asking, just quieter. Am I pushing forward because I should, or because I'm afraid to admit defeat? Am I committed, or just attached? Those questions don't have clean answers, and the lack of answers is what makes persistence feel unhinged at times. You're moving without certainty, acting without confirmation, choosing without guarantees. That's not madness, but it feels close enough that people confuse the two. Persistence also strips away performance. You stop explaining yourself because explanations require energy you don't have. You stop defending your reasons because they won't make sense to someone who already quit in their head. Silence replaces justification, and silence paired with continued action looks threatening. People prefer noise. They prefer arguments they can engage with. Quiet persistence offers nothing to debate. It just exists, steady and unapologetic. There's a loneliness to this stage that doesn't get talked about. The crowd thins out. The messages slow down. You realize how many relationships were tied to momentum rather than commitment. Persistence isolates you, not because you're better, but because you're willing to tolerate uncertainty longer than most. And tolerance for uncertainty is mistaken for insanity in a culture addicted to clarity. But here's the part that never makes it into polite conversation. Persistence that looks like madness is often the only kind that changes anything. Not the kind that's applauded, not the kind that's supported, the kind that survives skepticism, boredom, discomfort, and misunderstanding, the kind that doesn't rely on being understood, the kind that keeps moving even when the internal narrative collapses and all that is left is action. Because once you've gone far enough, stopping isn't neutral. It's not rest. It's not wisdom. It's a decision with consequences. You already understand too well. Persistence becomes less about reaching a destination and more about refusing to let doubt have the final word. And when you reach that point, whether people call it madness or not, stops mattering, because the only alternative feels like betraying something you can quite explain, but know you can't abandon doubt, hides behind. Maybe it wasn't meant for you because it sounds gentle enough to slip past your defenses. It doesn't attack you outright. It doesn't say you're weak or incapable. It pretends to care. It lowers its voice, softens its edges, and delivers the message like it's doing you a favor. Maybe this isn't your path. Maybe this isn't your time. Maybe you should stop forcing it. And that's what makes it dangerous. It feels compassionate while it dismantles you piece by piece. People love that phrase because it removes responsibility. If it wasn't meant for you, then no one has to explain why it didn't work. No one has to sit with the discomfort of effort without reward. No one has to admit they quit too early or misjudged you or misunderstood what commitment actually costs. Not meant for you wraps uncertainty in destiny and calls it wisdom. It gives doubt a spiritual accent and lets it walk around unquestioned. You hear it most often after you've already endured more than most would. After the third miss, after the fourth, after you've done everything that was asked of you and then some. That's when the phrase shows up, not at the beginning, not before the effort, but right when quitting would hurt the most. Right when stopping would feel like relief and betrayal at the same time. Doubt knows timing. It waits until you're tired, until you're isolated, until your certainty has been worn thin by silence. What's clever about it is how reasonable it sounds. It doesn't challenge your work ethic. It doesn't deny your sincerity. It simply reframes the failure as cosmic redirection, as if the universe has opinions about you personally, as if it sat down, reviewed your effort, and politely declined. And once you accept that framing, doubt wins without resistance. Because arguing with destiny feels arrogant, pushing back feels disrespectful. So you hesitate, you soften, you start considering the exit. But maybe it wasn't meant for you rarely comes from clarity. It comes from discomfort. From people who don't know how to sit with unresolved effort, from people who need clean narratives to stay emotionally stable. They can't tolerate ambiguity, so they spiritualize it. They can't tolerate endurance, so they call it attachment. And they can't tolerate watching you keep going, because it reminds them of the places they stopped and never returned to. The phrase also preys on your humility, on your willingness to question yourself. You don't want to be arrogant. You don't want to force something that isn't right. You don't want to be blind to signs. So you listen. You replay it in your head. You ask yourself if you're misreading the situation. And doubt loves that loop. It thrives in self-reflection without resolution. It convinces you that stepping back is maturity. even when stepping back costs you something essential. What nobody tells you is that destiny has terrible communication skills. If everything that doesn't work immediately wasn't meant, nothing meaningful would ever exist. Most things that matter look wrong before they look right. They resist, they misalign, they push back. And doubt knows this, but it also knows humans crave meaning. So it offers you an interpretation that feels bigger than fear, when really it's just fear wearing a ceremonial robe. You'll notice how quickly maybe it wasn't meant for you. Ends conversations. It shuts things down. There's no follow-up, no exploration, no curiosity. It's a full stop disguised as insight, and anyone who says it rarely sticks around to see what happens next. They deliver the line and move on, emotionally absolved. You're left holding the weight of that suggestion, wondering if continuing means you're defying something sacred rather than something scared. Inside you, the conflict sharpens. Part of you wants to believe it because believing it would make stopping easier. It would give you a story to tell that doesn't feel like failure. It would give you cover. But another part of you resists, quietly, stubbornly, because something about that phrase feels incomplete. It doesn't account for growth. It doesn't account for endurance. It doesn't account for the possibility that meaning isn't revealed before the struggle, but forged inside it. Doubt never says, "I'm afraid you'll get hurt again." It never says, "I don't know how this ends." It never admits uncertainty. It just hides behind destiny and lets you do the surrendering yourself. And if you're not careful, you'll mistake that surrender for peace. You'll call it acceptance. You'll tell yourself you're letting go, but deep down you'll feel the difference between release and retreat. Because the truth is, not meant for you is often just another way of saying, this is taking longer than I'm comfortable with, longer than society approves, longer than patience is applauded, longer than belief feels safe. And if you listen closely, you'll hear doubt hoping you stop, not because you're wrong, but because continuing would force a question no one wants to answer yet. A question about whether meaning is discovered or chosen, whether destiny is handed down or carved out, whether persistence is ignorance or devotion, whether the voice telling you to quit is divine guidance or just fear asking for a dignified exit.